Hey, welcome back to Score on Business. Pete Hendricks here. We're still with Kris Kelso. So Kris, we've been talking about the value of professional relationships. What's another book that has influenced your view of relationships?
So a few years back, I read a book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. Grant is a Wharton professor, and he did a really extensive study on how people relate to one another and think about being helpful and being generous in professional relationships. It was mostly a professional study, though the findings certainly overlap into our personal life and other areas. And what he found was there are basically three different styles or three different types of people. There are givers, there are takers, and then there are matchers. Now, the givers are naturally generous people that are willing to be helpful without really keeping score or looking for something in return. They're just willing to open up their knowledge, their resources, give their time, and they're willing to just help people out. Takers are sort of the opposite. They're always looking for what they can get out of a relationship and how do I get as much as I can without giving any more than I have to, and they're really sort of jilted towards a very selfish motive. And then matchers are the ones that kind of keep score. So I'll help you, but then I expect help back. Or if you help me, then I feel like I owe you, and I'm going to try to make sure we sort of stay on par.
If there's not balance, then because there's a lot of takers out there, and so you have to,
So the interesting thing is that when he looked at successful people and sort of a continuum of success, the bottom of the success rung, if you will, tend to be full of givers. However, the top successful people also tended to be givers. So givers gravitated to the top and the bottom, and takers and matchers end up kind of bunched together in the middle. Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so, of course, the next obvious question, and what he really studied, is what's the difference? Why do some givers end up at the bottom and some at the top? And what he found was that the givers at the bottom were selfless givers. They were very sacrificial, and they would give and give and give until they had nothing. And really, they would end up being the doormats, the people that are just run over. And you can see where if someone is just sort of, giving generously and not thinking about any kind of return, they can be taken advantage of, particularly by the takers. On the other hand, the givers at the top, the very successful givers, Adam Grant calls otherish givers. And what he means by that, he defines it as, I'm willing to be generous and helpful with no expectation of return as long as it doesn't detract from or derail my personal goals and objectives. And so what he really determined was that selfless otherishness or an others focused and self-interest are not mutually exclusive. You don't have to be selfish or giving and can't be both. That there's actually a style and a way to do both where you say, I have goals and I have objectives and priorities, and I'm gonna focus on those. Along the way, I'm gonna be generous any opportunity I have and not expect a return, not look for everything to be a matching scenario. But once that generosity puts my own goals at risk, I'm going to put some limits and boundaries on it. And those are the people that are most successful. And so there's some really interesting study that comes out of this whole study that he did. When you're talking about teams, he says it's important to recognize those dynamics at play when there are givers that are being trampled and taken advantage of versus when you have givers that are otherish but still very focused and driven. And those are the ones that are going to be very successful. And of course, matchers have an impact. One interesting note in terms of teams is that it takes 2 to 3 givers to offset the negative impact of a taker on a team or in a community. So if you've got a group of people and someone is just sort of selfishly sucking the life out of the organization, they're taking and not giving, you need 2 or 3 times as many givers to offset that negative impact. So it's really important to pay attention to the dynamics among teams.
That really, that lines up with some other research I've heard about, which is that when there's someone on the team who's a moaner and complainer, they often, nothing is done about that, and they do an awful lot of damage.
Yeah, it really can. So, as I read that book, well, first of all, the very first chapter of that book was really eye-opening, and I started to see professional relationships differently. I had already for years been focused on building and maintaining good professional relationships, and had built, you know, my first business and a lot of my career on building a strong network of people. But as I read the psychology behind these three different dispositions, I started to look at people a little bit differently, and probably most importantly, to recognize when I'm dealing with a taker, I have to be careful to put some boundaries on some things.
Yes.
I need to sort of have that otherish giver flag really high, and make sure that I'm not being selfish and completely withdrawn, but that I only let it go so far, and make sure that I'm not completely taken advantage of. Also, when I'm dealing with a matcher, I have to recognize that they're gonna keep score, right?
Yeah.
And that if they help me, they're expecting something in return, and I can't just assume that everybody who's generous is a giver and is not worried about keeping track.
Right.
Personally, I try to be more of a giver, because those are the otherish givers that are most successful, and also to me it's just easier to not try to keep score of who's doing what for who.
But you know,
and have a rating system in your mind.
You know, human relationships, they work when there's some kind of balance.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know what I found is that oftentimes the people that help me, I can't necessarily help them back.
Right.
And some of the people that I can help can't really help me, and so I take a little bit of a pay it forward approach.
Right. What goes around comes around.
And trust that if I help someone that can't reciprocate, it's okay, they don't owe me anything, but broadly, I'm going to be repaid in the goodwill that I build in the community, the reputation that I've created, the success of my work that comes back to me in ways that you can't necessarily draw a direct line from I did this favor and had this good thing happen to me. But it works out in the long run to be a generous person and be a giver in business.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
And you can't do it foolishly.
Right. Yeah, you have to be really careful to, and put some boundaries on it.
Yeah,
be smart
that's
about
a good way. Okay, well, let's take a break. Ladies and gents, we will be right back.